a freezing October night in 1939, a lone German submarine slipped silently through the defenses of Scapa Flow under curtains of shimmering aurora. Hours later, the battleship Royal Oak was torn apart by torpedoes. 833 men lost in one of the most daring raids of the war. This is episode 22 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. In our last episode, we followed the fiery early clashes across the Pacific. Tonight, we turn to the cold grey Atlantic, where the war at sea truly began. From Prien's audacious strike to the first wolf packs, the struggle that would decide Britain's survival is about to unfold. I've shaped this one carefully so it holds your attention while the tension of the day slowly melts away. If these episodes help you unwind, a like and subscription mean a lot, and I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Take a slow breath and let's begin. The evening of October 13th, 1939, arrived quietly over the North Sea. Somewhere beneath those cold, restless waters, a German submarine had been lying motionless on the sill since morning, her crew sealed inside in near silence, waiting for darkness, waiting for the tide, waiting for the moment that would define the early months of an already brutal war. Just after 7 o'clock, the conning tower of U-47 broke the surface. The hatch swung open, and Lieutenant Commander Günther Prien pulled himself up into the open air. He was 31 years old, sharp-eyed, and composed in the particular way that skilled commanders learn to be. A stillness worn on the outside, while the mind moved quickly beneath it. What greeted him was not what he had hoped for. The sky above the Orkney Islands was alive with colour. Vast curtains of the aurora borealis rippled and pulsed across the northern horizon, casting a spectral glow across the water that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Prien had been promised a moonless night, choppy but manageable seas, and a fresh breeze, conditions ideal for a submarine approaching enemy waters unseen. Nature had delivered all of that, and then added something the charts could never have warned him about, a light show visible for miles in every direction. For a long moment, he considered turning back. The mission, audacious even in conception, now felt exposed before it had even begun. Weeks would pass before tides and moon phases aligned this favorably again, and there was something else, something harder to calculate. The mood aboard the boat. His crew had been briefed, had absorbed the gravity of what lay ahead, and had settled into that peculiar calm that comes when men have already chosen to go forward despite the danger. Rebuilding that resolve after a retreat would be another matter entirely. Prien had been selected personally by Commodore Karl Dönitz, the head of Germany's submarine arm, to lead the first special U-boat operation of the war. The target was Scapa Flow, a vast, deep anchorage tucked within the Orkney Islands, home to the British Home Fleet. To call it heavily defended was almost an understatement. Sunken ships blocked its entrances. Mines and anti-submarine nets lay beneath its surface. Royal Navy patrols moved through its approaches around the clock, and the currents that ran through its narrow channels were swift and unpredictable, capable of throwing a submerged vessel sideways without warning. Dönitz had studied aerial photographs for weeks, looking for any seam in the defences. He believed he had found one, a slender northern passage called Kirk Sound, where 3 sunken vessels sat as blockers but left gaps that a skilled navigator in a small surface-running submarine might thread if the conditions were right and the nerve held. He reminded Prien when handing him the assignment that 2 German submarines had attempted something similar during the previous war. Neither had returned. The U-47 had slipped from her moorings at Kiel on the morning of October 8th, moving through the Kiel Canal and out into the grey North Sea. The crew did not yet know their destination when the submarine spotted distant smoke on the horizon, and Prien ordered an immediate dive rather than investigation. Suspicion stirred among the men. Something was different about this patrol, something larger than usual. Only when the boat surfaced near the Orkneys to recharge batteries did Prien take his first watch officer, Engelbert Endres, aside. "Hold on to something," he told him. "We're going into Scapa Flow." The rest of the crew learned the truth shortly after, and Prien ordered a meal to mark the occasion. Pork ribs and cabbage, served in padded silence, the cook shuffling about with his feet wrapped in rags to muffle any sound as the submarine lay barely submerged, reducing every possible chance of detection. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of ceremony. 7.5 hours later, the U-47 entered Holm Sound on the surface, Prien navigating from memory. The land closed in on both sides. The wrecks of the sunken block ships loomed ahead, their funnels and masts rising from the water like the remains of something long forgotten. Prien would record in his log that it felt eerie, mountains dark against the sky, the aurora painting the basin in cold, shifting light, the block ships hanging in the passage like props on a theatre stage. Along the shore road to his right, he could make out a single cyclist heading home, the faint beam of a lamp tracing a quiet path through the darkness. The world above carried on, unknowing. Then a current caught the submarine and pushed her hard to starboard. The hull scraped a cable trailing from one of the wrecks, and for a moment the boat touched bottom. Prien worked the controls with deliberate care, adjusting, correcting, feeling the boat respond. And then, in one rapid, precise maneuver, he brought U-47 through the gap. By midnight, she was inside Scapa Flow. The anchorage was nearly empty. Prien had expected to find the British home fleet spread before him, a forest of masts and funnels, hulking silhouettes riding at anchor in the darkness. Instead, the water was wide and still, offering almost nothing. He edged the U-47 northward, moving carefully, his eyes working the horizon with the patience of a man who understood that haste in these waters could be fatal. Then, gradually, shapes began to resolve out of the darkness. First came the low, crouching profiles of destroyers moored close to shore. Then, rising behind them, the unmistakable skyline of something much larger. 2 great ships, their masts tracing lines against the dim sky. One was the battleship Royal Oak, the other was the seaplane carrier Pegasus, though in the half-light Prien mistook her for the battlecruiser Repulse. He turned to Endres and quietly invited him to look. There, behind the nearest ship, was another. The geometry of the opportunity had arranged itself almost perfectly. The U-47 settled into position some 4,000 yards from her targets. All 4 bow torpedo tubes were aimed and ready, the overlapping silhouettes of the 2 British ships filling the sights. Prien gave the order. There was the familiar hiss of compressed air, the shudder of discharge running through the hull, and then silence. The crew counted seconds, each one stretching longer than the last. What should have been a series of devastating explosions produced only a single muted thump, one torpedo, possibly striking the Royal Oak's bow or anchor chain, detonated without apparent effect. A stern tube fired as the boat turned away also found nothing. Prien waited for what seemed inevitable. The British would have felt that impact. Searchlights would come on. Destroyers would accelerate toward him. The silence that followed was, in its own way, more unsettling than any alarm could have been. But nothing came. Aboard the Royal Oak, the dull thud had been attributed to some internal mechanical failure, a burst pipe, perhaps, or a malfunction below decks. Both Captain W.G. Ben and Rear Admiral H.E.C. Blagrove, who was also on board, concluded there was nothing to investigate. The most important anchorage in the British Isles had just absorbed a torpedo strike and responded with barely a shrug. Prien could not have known any of this. He only knew that the counterattack he had been bracing for had not materialized, and that the target still sat motionless in the dark. While his crew labored to reload the forward torpedo tubes, he turned the boat and began circling back into position beneath the still shifting glow of the aurora. When the tubes were ready, he gave the order again. This time, the sea answered. 3 torpedoes struck in rapid succession, and the Royal Oak came apart in stages. First a massive concussion, then pillars of water climbing against the sky, then fire leaping from the hull in sheets as something deep inside the ship ignited. Ammunition, fuel, the vessel's own terrible stored energy turning against her. Prien recorded the moment with terse economy. Columns of water, columns of fire, splinters flying through the air, the harbour erupting to life, lights blazing on the destroyers, signal lamps flashing in every direction, and on the road barely 200 meters away, automobiles accelerating into the night. The Royal Oak listed, rolled onto her side, and slid beneath the surface of Scapa Flow in 13 minutes. 833 officers and men went down with her. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened. The U-47 turned east and drove hard for the escape channel. Behind her, a wake of white foam caught the light, entirely too visible, entirely too clear. An automobile on the coastal road braked to a halt, its headlights sweeping across the conning tower before the driver turned and sped back the way he had come. Prien was certain the alarm had been given. The tide was running in hard from the east, and even with every engine straining, the submarine made barely more than a knot against it. The channel that had seemed manageable hours earlier now felt impossibly narrow, the land pressing in on both sides, a wooden pier jutting from the island shore close enough to touch. Astern, Scapa Flow churned with activity. A destroyer was moving toward them, her searchlight probing the dark water in wide, methodical arcs. Yard by yard, the U-47 forced her way through. The destroyer passed to the rear and dropped depth charges, but the electronic tracking device had locked onto a sunken wreck lying somewhere in the Sound, and the charges exploded harmlessly in the wrong place. The submarine did not stop to confirm it. She pressed on into Holmes Sound, and then out into the open North Sea. As the coast fell away behind them, Prien made one final entry in his log. The glow from Scapa Flow, he wrote, was still visible. For years, the German Navy had occupied a peculiar position within the Third Reich, tolerated, funded at a fraction of what its leaders believed necessary, and perpetually overshadowed. The army was Hitler's favored instrument, the embodiment of his vision of continental conquest. The Luftwaffe enjoyed the enthusiastic patronage of Hermann Göring, who understood the propaganda value of aircraft and made certain that his service was never short of resources or attention. The Navy, by contrast, existed at the margins, important enough to be maintained, not important enough to be transformed. Dönitz had argued the case for submarines with the persistence of a man who had given the better part of his professional life to a single conviction, that the only weapon capable of bringing Britain to its knees was a large, well-coordinated fleet of U-boats. The argument was logical. The British Isles depended on seaborne imports for survival. Strangle those sea lanes and Britain could not fight. The math was straightforward. The political will to act on it was not, and Dönitz had been largely ignored. Prien's raid changed the atmosphere overnight. 2 days after the Royal Oak went down, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, circulated a memorandum that began with words that had rarely appeared in connection with the submarine arm. The Führer, it announced, was granting permission for a series of war orders, the most consequential of which authorized U-boats to torpedo, without any prior warning, all merchant ships that could be positively identified as British or French. The order marked a decisive escalation, but it had not arrived without precedent. Germany had entered the war nominally bound by the Hague Convention, which prohibited attacking enemy passenger and merchant ships without warning. One British passenger liner, the Athenia, had been sunk without warning within hours of the war's beginning, an act carried out in direct violation of Hitler's standing instructions by a U-boat commander who had misjudged her identity. The incident had been an embarrassment, not a policy. But as the weeks passed and it became clear that this war would not end quickly or through negotiation, the restrictions had begun to loosen. On September 23rd, Hitler authorized the halting and sinking of enemy merchant ships that used their radios. The following day, an order protecting French vessels was quietly withdrawn. A week later, attacks in the North Sea were freed from prior constraint. Then the zone of permitted unrestricted action expanded to the waters off the French and British coasts, and then again to reach 170 miles west of Ireland, each extension announced with bureaucratic calm, each one representing a wider reach for the submarines already operating in those waters. Raeder's post-Scapa Flow directive was the culmination of this progression. It removed the remaining barriers against attacking Allied merchant shipping. Passenger ships were still theoretically entitled to a warning, but even that distinction was abandoned by the middle of November. Within weeks of Prien's exploit, the U-boats had been given license to wage unrestricted war against everything afloat beneath an Allied flag. The practical meaning of that transformation was not yet fully visible on any chart or balance sheet, but it was being felt quietly in the ledgers of British shipping offices, in the anxious conversations of naval planners, and in the cold arithmetic of tonnage lost versus tonnage built. Britain's ability to endure the war ahead rested on a continuous flow of goods across thousands of miles of open water. Every restriction lifted against German submarines was another increment of danger added to that flow. Prien himself was feted as a national hero. 2 weeks after the attack, he and his crew stood in the Chancellery in Berlin, guests of the Führer. There, in a ceremony that German radio broadcast to every corner of the Reich, Prien was awarded the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross, the highest military decoration that could be bestowed. The young men who served under him had paddled quietly through enemy waters with their feet wrapped in cloth. They had lain on the seabed for hours in silence. They had navigated by memory through a channel blocked by sunken ships and pulled a submarine free from the mud. And now they stood in the chancellery, shaking hands and accepting medals, while somewhere across the North Sea the wreck of the Royal Oak settled into the silt of Scapa Flow with more than 800 men sealed inside her. The war at sea had taken a new shape, and it was only beginning. Britain is an island. That fact, so elementary as to seem almost beside the point in calmer times, became the defining condition of the entire war. Everything the country needed to survive and to fight. Every barrel of fuel oil, every ton of iron ore, every bushel of grain, every bale of wool had to arrive by sea. There was no alternative. There was no overland route, no continental pipeline, no reserve deep enough to outlast a prolonged blockade. The ocean was Britain's only road, and in the autumn of 1939, that road was already under threat. The scale of what was required was staggering in its specifics. Mutton and butter from New Zealand, beef from Argentina, lumber from Canada. These were not luxuries but necessities, the raw materials of feeding a population and sustaining a war economy. Wool from Australia, iron ore from Africa, rubber from Malaya, grain from the United States and Canada and Argentina, oil from the Middle East and the Dutch West Indies and the American coast, all of it moving aboard ships, always aboard ships, threading their way across thousands of miles of ocean that was becoming more dangerous by the week. To keep that supply moving required a merchant fleet of roughly 3,000 vessels. On any given day, around 2,500 of those ships were somewhere at sea, in harbour, in convoy, in the approaches to British ports, or crossing open water with no escort at all. Nearly 1 million tons of essential material had to arrive every week for Britain to sustain even a minimal war effort. Fall below that threshold, and the arithmetic became dire very quickly. Beyond the goods and raw materials, there were men to consider. Canada was already sending soldiers. Australia was preparing to do the same. Across the Commonwealth, South Africa, Rhodesia, New Zealand, India, governments were organizing contingents, arranging transport, preparing to send their people to fight the same enemy their fathers had faced a generation earlier. And if the United States eventually entered the conflict, as some hoped and others feared, the Atlantic would become even more vital, even more crowded, even more contested. The Germans understood this entirely. Their naval planning had always taken Britain's dependence on maritime supply as a starting point. The admirals had considered battleships and cruisers as potential commerce raiders, capable of hunting merchant ships across the open sea. They had developed plans for mining the waters around British ports, seeding the approaches with explosives that would trap or destroy ships before they could unload. Armed merchantmen, freighters disguised to look innocent, had been envisioned as a kind of guerrilla force at sea, capable of approaching unsuspecting captains before revealing their true nature. But all of these methods, whatever their individual merit, were supplements to the main effort. The central logic of the German naval strategy was submarine warfare. Dönitz and his staff had always understood that U-boats, operated in sufficient numbers, represented the most efficient means of severing Britain's supply lines. The surface raider could be hunted down and sunk, as the months ahead would demonstrate. A submarine, by contrast, was nearly invisible, could travel submerged to avoid detection, and could slip in among a convoy's ships before the escorts knew where to look. That central insight had not yet been translated into sufficient material force. Germany did not have enough submarines, and the ones it had were being stretched thin across too many obligations, but the direction of the war at sea had been set in motion. The escalation of unrestricted submarine warfare, the expansion of permitted attack zones, the removal of safeguards around merchant shipping, all of it pointed toward a gathering storm on the Atlantic that was still building its full strength. What Churchill would later describe as the one thing in the war that truly frightened him was not yet visible in its full dimensions, but the outlines were already there, traced in the sinking records of September and October 1939, in the cold water of Scapa Flow, and in the orders that continued to accumulate on the desks of German naval headquarters. The sea lanes that Britain depended on were not yet broken, but they were being tested steadily and with increasing purpose by an enemy who had identified exactly where the island nation was most exposed. The Germans knew precisely where to strike. British naval planners, for their part, had spent the years before the war constructing a series of assumptions that would prove, one by one, to be mistaken. The first and most consequential of those assumptions was that the Germans would not repeat what they had done in the previous war. The logic seemed reasonable enough at the time. Unrestricted submarine warfare had been one of the deciding factors in bringing the United States into the conflict in 1917, and Germany had lost. The lesson appeared self-evident. Moreover, the London Submarine Protocol of 1936 had been signed by Germany along with the other major naval powers, and it expressly prohibited attacking unescorted merchant vessels without warning. Any submarine intending to sink a merchant ship was required to surface first, search the vessel, verify the presence of contraband, and ensure that the crew had a safe means of reaching shore. An enemy sailor's lifeboat in the open ocean did not qualify as a safe means unless land was within reach. These requirements had a practical implication that naval planners noted with some satisfaction. They forced submarines to surface before attacking, making them visible, vulnerable to even lightly armed targets, and susceptible to the reinforcements that a radio call could bring. If the rules were followed, the submarine threat was manageable. But the German Navy's own operational instructions had long contained a straightforward counterpoint to this optimism. Fighting methods, the instructions read, would never be abandoned simply because international regulations stood opposed to them. No one in the German naval hierarchy had any serious intention of honoring treaty restrictions once a war of survival, as they understood it, was underway. Beyond the misplaced confidence in treaty obligations, the British Admiralty had been preoccupied with a different kind of threat. The old guard admirals who ran the Royal Navy had spent the interwar years watching Germany rebuild a surface fleet, and their imaginations ran toward the great confrontations of the previous war. The Battle of Jutland, that vast, thundering collision of capital ships in 1916, remained the template against which future naval warfare was measured. Battleships versus battleships, a decisive engagement in the North Sea. That was the war the Navy prepared for. The British building program of the late 1930s reflected these priorities: 5 new battleships, 6 aircraft carriers, 19 heavy cruisers, all ordered between 1936 and 1939. These were precisely the kinds of vessels suited for fighting an enemy fleet in open water. They were far less suited for the patient, grinding, dispersed work of escorting merchant convoys and hunting submarines across thousands of square miles of grey ocean. There was also, at the Admiralty, a degree of confidence rooted in technology. During and after the First World War, The Allies had developed a detection system that offered the prospect of finding submerged submarines with reliable accuracy. The device had been created by the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, and it was known by the initials of that committee, ASDIC. An American version of the same technology would later be called sonar. The system worked by transmitting a pulse of sound from a dome fitted to the underside of a ship's hull. When that pulse struck a submerged object and returned, the echo revealed the direction and range of whatever lay below. In ideal conditions with a trained and experienced operator, ASDIC was a genuine tool. The problem was that ideal conditions were rarely encountered, and truly experienced operators were rare at the beginning of the war. Most of the men assigned to the equipment had come from civilian life with no prior exposure to it, had completed a 3-month training course, and had then been sent to sea. To an inexperienced ear, every echo looked the same: submerged rocks, schools of fish, wrecks on the bottom, variations in water temperature between different layers, and occasionally an actual submarine. The distinction required time and practice that most operators did not yet have. Even for the skilled, the geometry of the system created a blind spot that U-boat commanders were quick to exploit. The sound beam narrowed as a submarine and a hunting ship drew closer together, eventually losing contact entirely at close range. And there was something more fundamental still. ASDIC could only detect submarines that were underwater. Against a submarine running on the surface, particularly at night, it was useless. Admiral Dönitz understood this limitation clearly. His response was elegantly simple. He ordered his boats to attack at night and to do so on the surface. It was a decision that would shape the entire character of the Atlantic War. Submarines, despite the name, would spend most of their operational lives above water, traveling at speeds nearly 3 times what they could manage when submerged, invisible in the darkness, and entirely beyond the reach of the one technology that the British had placed so much faith in. The war Britain had prepared for, and the war that was actually coming, were two very different things. The convoy system was not a new idea. It had been one of the hard-won discoveries of the previous war, a lesson purchased at tremendous cost in ships and lives before the Admiralty finally accepted it, organizing merchant vessels into groups and surrounding them with naval escorts had cut British shipping losses by 80% in 1917. The principle was straightforward. A lone ship was easy prey, a convoy with escorts was far more difficult to approach, and any submarine that attacked one risked being detected and driven off before it could cause serious damage. That lesson had been learned, it had been documented, and in the opening phase of the Second World War, it was being partially ignored. At the outbreak of hostilities, a significant portion of the available escort vessels were assigned not to convoy protection, but to patrol and search operations. Ships moved back and forth through large sections of empty ocean, burning fuel, wearing out machinery, and providing no direct protection to any merchant vessel traveling beyond their range. The theory, such as it was, held that active patrols in contested waters would suppress submarine activity. In practice, the ocean was simply too large, the submarine too mobile, and the patrol ships too few for the mathematics to work in Britain's favor. Merchant ships that traveled independently outside any convoy were left to their own navigation and whatever luck the sea offered. In September of 1939 alone, even before Hitler authorized the full expansion of submarine warfare, the toll was severe. The passenger liner Athenia was lost. The aircraft carrier Courageous on anti-submarine patrol when it should not have been used for such exposed duty was torpedoed and sunk. 41 merchant vessels went to the bottom in that single month. The pressure of accumulating losses would eventually move the Admiralty toward a more effective convoy structure. But effective escort coverage, the kind that could genuinely protect ships crossing the North Atlantic, would not materialize until 1943. The gap between the lesson learned in 1917 and its full implementation in the present war spanned 4 years of loss and grief, and ships disappearing into cold water. The need for more escort vessels had been recognized before the fighting began. In April 1939, when Hitler announced his intention to exceed the limits of the Anglo-German naval agreement that had capped submarine tonnage on both sides, the Admiralty responded by ordering 56 new vessels. These were the first of what would become known as the Flower-class corvettes, small maneuverable ships that could be built relatively quickly and inexpensively in British shipyards. They were suited for the kind of close escort work that the Atlantic demanded, tough enough to survive heavy weather, fast enough to chase a surfaced submarine, and cheap enough to produce in the numbers that the situation would eventually require. The first of them would not be ready until the spring of 1940. Many more would follow, but only gradually, and never quite fast enough to fill the gaps that the submarine campaign was opening in Britain's maritime defences. There was, beneath all of this, a cultural resistance within the senior naval establishment that was difficult to dislodge. The admirals who had spent their careers preparing for a great fleet engagement did not naturally think in terms of convoy protection. Escort duty, in the hierarchy of naval prestige, ranked far below the clean drama of battle between capital ships. Anti-submarine warfare was patient, technical, grinding, and largely invisible, the opposite of everything the service's traditions celebrated. Recognizing the problem intellectually was one thing, reorienting an entire institution around it was another. What made the situation more precarious still was a certain confidence, false as it proved, that modern technology had solved the submarine problem at its root. If ASDIC could reliably detect enemy boats, and if the Navy built enough escort ships to act on those detections, then the threat could be contained. That chain of reasoning led planners to underestimate the scale of the building effort required, the time it would take to train adequate crews, and the ingenuity of an adversary who had already found the system's central weakness and built his entire strategy around it. By the close of 1939, the shape of the crisis was becoming visible to those willing to look at the numbers honestly. Roughly 1 1/3 Allied ships were being lost every day. The rate was troubling in isolation, set against the pace of new construction and the volume of supplies that Britain required to sustain both its population and its war machine. It was deeply alarming. The battle had not yet reached its most dangerous phase. That was still ahead, still gathering force across the grey Atlantic, still waiting for the conditions that would bring it to full, terrible expression. Whatever the ambitions that German naval strategy carried into the autumn of 1939, the material reality was considerably more modest. Germany began the war with 56 submarines. 10 of those were not operational when the fighting started. Of the 46 that remained, nearly half were small coastal boats, useful for training and for laying mines in shallow waters, but unsuited for the long oceanic passages that the Atlantic campaign required. Only 22 boats displaced 500 tons or more, the minimum needed for sustained operations in open water, and of those, standard operational mathematics meant that only about 1/3 could actually be hunting enemy ships at any given moment. A third would always be in port for maintenance, resupply, and crew rest. Another third would be in transit to or from the patrol areas, consuming days of operational time on the long journey north around the Orkney Islands and out into the Atlantic approaches. The geography itself imposed a further penalty. The U-boat bases at Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven, and Kiel sat in the southern reaches of the North Sea. To reach the convoy lanes in the Atlantic, a submarine had to travel hundreds of miles around the top of Scotland, a passage that consumed fuel, wore on machinery, and shortened the window of time available for actual patrol work. In the early months of the war, the consequence of all this was stark. Rarely more than a handful of German submarines were operating in the Atlantic simultaneously. Raeder had understood this weakness before the first shot was fired. He had watched the British Navy for decades, and he held no illusions about the relative strength of the forces he commanded. Britain's fleet included 15 battleships and battle cruisers, 6 aircraft carriers. Germany had none. 58 cruisers against Germany's 8, plus a handful of destroyers and torpedo boats. Direct confrontation was out of the question. Raeder's entire surface strategy rested on dispersal and disruption, keeping the Royal Navy occupied across a wide area, never allowing it to concentrate, never giving it the decisive battle it was built to win. Dönitz had been pressing for more submarines throughout the interwar period, and he had been pressing harder still as the war approached. He had calculated that a force of 100 U-boats could achieve more lasting damage to British commerce than any number of battle cruisers. Given 300, operating in coordinated groups, spread across the convoy routes, attacking in concentrated swarms, he was confident he could sever Britain's supply lines entirely and force the war to a conclusion. He had neither 100 nor 300. He had 46, of which only a fraction were usefully positioned at any moment. The promised intensification of U-boat construction had been authorized in principle, but had not yet translated into completed vessels. Building a submarine took time to lay the keel, time to fit the systems, time to test and commission and train the crew. Dönitz had been told that meaningful expansion of his fleet would begin arriving in the latter part of 1941. Until then, he worked with what he had. What he had, it must be said, was not without capability. The submarines entering service in 1939 and 1940 were more sophisticated than anything that had gone before them. Improved battery technology allowed them to remain submerged longer. Torpedo design had advanced, though the magnetic detonators that were supposed to explode beneath a ship's keel, maximizing structural damage, would prove unreliable in the early months of combat. Radio communications had been transformed since the previous war, making it possible for surfaced submarines to exchange information with one another and with headquarters across distances that would have seemed implausible 20 years earlier. That communications capability was the seed from which the Wolfpack strategy would eventually grow. For the moment, though, the numbers told the story. A navy that aspired to blockade an island nation and strangle its economy was prosecuting that campaign with a force that amounted, on most days, to a few submarines in a very large ocean. The results were not negligible. The toll in September 1939 had been significant enough to alarm British planners, but they were far below what Dönitz believed the situation demanded. The tools were present in embryonic form. The strategy was clearly conceived. What was missing was scale, and scale was a matter of time, of steel, of shipyard capacity, and of a war that was still finding its shape. Two men shaped the character of Germany's war at sea more than any others. Between them, they embodied the tension between the kind of navy Germany had and the kind it needed, and between the war that had been planned and the one that was actually being fought. Erich Raeder had been the German Navy's highest-ranking officer since 1928. He was a veteran of the First World War, a man who had stood on the bridge of a cruiser at the Battle of Jutland and watched the great fleets maneuver and clash. That experience had formed his professional imagination in ways that never entirely loosened. He thought in terms of capital ships, of strategic positioning, of fleet prestige and the weight of armored steel. He was also, by September 1939, deeply apprehensive. He understood that the war had come several years before the Navy was ready for it, before the building programs were complete, before the training pipelines had filled, before the balance of forces had shifted in Germany's favor. On the day Britain and France declared war, Raeder wrote a sentence that has been quoted ever since, in part because of its unusual candor. Germany's surface forces, he observed, could do no more than demonstrate that they knew how to die with gallantry. It was not a statement of despair so much as a clear-eyed assessment of mathematics. The Royal Navy was simply larger, and a direct confrontation would be suicidal. Whatever the surface fleet accomplished would be achieved through speed, stealth, and the strategic disruption of a vastly superior opponent. Admiral Dönitz occupied a different place in the German naval hierarchy, and he approached the problem from a different angle. A decade younger than Raeder, he had commanded a submarine in the previous war and had been sunk in the Mediterranean in the final weeks of the conflict. He had spent nearly 10 months as a prisoner in a British camp, and the experience had given him something valuable: time to think through what submarine warfare could be and what it would require to reach its full potential. After his repatriation, Dönitz had remained in naval service through the lean years of the Weimar Republic, when Germany was prohibited by the Versailles Treaty from operating submarines at all. He served with the surface fleet, and those who worked alongside him noted both his directness and a particular quality of personal warmth, an attentiveness to the men under his command that went beyond the formal obligations of rank. He advanced through successive postings, eventually taking command of the light cruiser Emden. Then, in July 1935, Admiral Raeder came aboard the Emden at Wilhelmshaven with news. Germany had just signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which among other things authorized a German submarine force equivalent in tonnage to Britain's. Submarines were legal again, and Dönitz was to command them. He had set about rebuilding the fleet with the energy of a man for whom this had been the only real goal all along. The submarines being designed and laid down during the late 1930s were technically superior to their predecessors, longer range, more reliably armed, capable of staying submerged for extended periods, and since 1922 German civilian engineers had been quietly working through a front company in The Hague, continuing the development of submarine technology in formal peacetime conditions. Germany's shipyards had been quietly busy as well. 10 days after the 1935 pact took effect, the first new German submarine was launched from a heavily guarded berth at Kiel. By early 1936, Dönitz had a flotilla of 12 small boats and the beginning of a training structure around them. What he had been developing alongside the vessels themselves was a doctrine. Dönitz had concluded that the next war would be decided in the Atlantic, and that submarines alone could not sink convoys efficiently by attacking in isolation. A single U-boat approaching a convoy guarded by escorts could achieve something, but it risked being detected and driven off before it had sunk more than a ship or two. The solution, as he came to see it, was concentration. Multiple submarines attacking simultaneously from different angles would overwhelm any escort screen. The escorts could not be everywhere at once. The mathematics of distributed attack favored the attacker. He called it the Wolf Pack, and it required two things above all: enough submarines to make it work, and the radio communications infrastructure to coordinate them in real time across hundreds of miles of open water. The communications were becoming possible. The submarines were not yet there in the numbers required. That gap between conception and execution would define the first years of the Atlantic campaign, and Dönitz would spend much of his energy trying to close it. The challenge that Dönitz faced was not simply a matter of building submarines. It was a matter of building them within a military and political environment that consistently prioritized other things, and doing so while also developing the tactics, the training, and the command infrastructure that would be needed to make them effective once they were at sea. The Third Reich was not short of ambition in its military spending. What it was short of, at least from the Navy's perspective, was balance. The Army consumed resources on a scale that dwarfed every other service. The Luftwaffe, with Goering's personal patronage and Hitler's genuine fascination with aircraft, occupied a privileged second tier. The Navy came third, reliably and consistently, receiving enough to remain functional and little more. When Raeder managed to secure Hitler's attention long enough to make a case for naval investment, the Führer's imagination was drawn toward the most visible and dramatic options: large battleships, vessels that generated press coverage when they sailed into foreign ports, and that satisfied some deep aesthetic preference for monumental hardware. The submarine was not a monumental instrument. It was invisible by design, hidden beneath the surface, anonymous in operation. Its victories were announced by the disappearance of ships at sea rather than by anything the cameras could capture. Hitler understood submarines as a weapon, but he did not love them the way he loved a battleship silhouette against the skyline. In 1938, a significant shift occurred in German strategic planning. Up to that point, the military had been preparing primarily for wars against continental neighbors, Poland, France, perhaps a combination of both. When Hitler instructed his military chiefs to add Great Britain to the list of plausible future opponents, the Navy was forced into a comprehensive reassessment of what it was for and what it needed to become. The resulting internal debate produced two sharply different proposals. The first was essentially Dönitz's position: focus the available resources on submarine construction and on the additional tools that could strangle British commerce: armed merchant raiders, pocket battleships. This path was achievable within a relatively short time. The second was the Z Plan, a far more sweeping vision of a balanced fleet built around new aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sufficient to challenge British naval dominance directly. Hitler chose the Z Plan. In January 1939, he ordered it placed at the top of the construction priority list. The decision was, from Dönitz's perspective, a defeat. The submarines he wanted and needed would remain in short supply, while yards and resources were redirected toward larger, more prestigious vessels. 9 months later, the decision became irrelevant. Germany was at war, and the Z Plan became the first casualty of the campaign it had been designed to win. The ships it envisioned would not be built in time for this conflict. What Germany had was what it had: 46 operational submarines, a handful of pocket battleships, a surface navy that was modern in some respects and dangerously thin in others, and a doctrine of commerce warfare that was theoretically sound and materially underfunded. Dönitz positioned every available U-boat for action in the Atlantic, the North Sea and the Baltic. The losses began immediately, running at roughly 2 submarines per month, and for the first year of the war he could barely replace them as fast as they were being sunk. Building a fleet while fighting with it was a grinding, dispiriting calculation, and the numbers rarely moved in the direction he needed. What he could control, he controlled with careful attention. Training was rigorous. The selection of commanders was deliberate, with Dönitz personally involved in identifying the men he believed had the combination of skill, nerve, and judgment that submarine command required. The officers who rose to lead boats in these early months, men like Prien, Kretschmer, Schulze, and others following close behind them, had been trained in a culture that prized independence, improvisation, and the aggressive exploitation of any opening an enemy presented. The boats themselves, inadequate in number as they were, carried real capability. Their batteries allowed extended submersion. Their torpedoes, when they functioned correctly, left no visible wake and carried enough explosive charge to destroy a ship with a single hit. And their commanders were developing, through hard experience, a body of tactical knowledge about convoy approaches, escort behavior, and the geometry of night surface attacks that no training exercise could fully replicate. The fleet Dönitz needed was still in the future. The fleet he had was already in action, and already beginning to show what that future might look like. The naval war that opened in September 1939 was fought with every tool both sides had available, and some of the most lethal instruments were among the least glamorous. Mines, floating or seabed anchored explosives, positioned to destroy ships that passed too close, had none of the drama of a surface engagement or the cat-and-mouse tension of a submarine hunt. They simply waited, patient and blind, for a hull to wander within their reach. Both sides sowed them by the thousands. The British, observing international convention, relied on the contact mine. Moored beneath the surface by a steel cable, it detonated when struck directly by a ship. German mine-laying, meanwhile, introduced a more troubling variety. The magnetic mine rested on the seabed in shallow coastal waters and required no physical contact to detonate it. The magnetic field generated by a steel-hulled ship passing overhead was sufficient to trigger it. Against this weapon, conventional sweeping, the technique of dragging a cable between two ships to cut the mooring lines of conventional mines, was useless. The device simply sat on the bottom, inert and invisible, waiting. The British did not discover the mechanism of these devices until the summer of 1940, after the Luftwaffe accidentally dropped one on the mudflats of the Thames estuary. Until then, magnetic mines were a menace without a clear countermeasure, and in the autumn and early winter of 1939 they were sinking more ships than the U-boats themselves. The loss rate was serious enough that even as the submarine threat commanded attention, the mine problem was quietly carving its own toll from British shipping. Germany's surface fleet, meanwhile, had been deploying its limited assets according to Radar's strategy of dispersal and disruption. The pocket battleships Deutschland and Graf Spee had both been positioned in the Atlantic before the war even formally began, ready to strike at commercial shipping the moment Hitler gave the word. For 3 weeks, political caution had restrained them. Hitler still hoped that a quick conquest of Poland might lead to a negotiated settlement with Britain and France, and he did not want to provoke an escalation. When that hope dissolved, the ships were released. 2 pocket battleships hunting across millions of square miles of ocean created an outsized effect. Even before they sank a significant amount of tonnage, their presence forced the Royal Navy to organize 9 separate hunting groups, 22 warships drawn from duties that were needed elsewhere to locate vessels that were expertly evading contact. It was a form of strategic leverage, 2 ships immobilizing 22. Germany's battle cruisers added to the pressure. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau operated in the North Sea, and in November 1939 they sank the British armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi, a liner converted to warship duty, wholly outclassed by the heavily armed German vessels that caught her. The engagement was brief and one-sided, but it served raiders' larger purpose of keeping British naval attention fractured across multiple simultaneous threats. By the late autumn of 1939, a combination of submarine torpedoes, magnetic mines, surface raiders, and the general disruption of British maritime routines had accounted for a meaningful volume of lost shipping, yet the pace had not yet reached the level that would truly alarm the Admiralty. Germany's surface navy was a limited instrument, stretched thin across too many assignments. The U-boats were fighting effectively but had not yet achieved the concentration of effort that Dönitz believed was necessary. The magnetic mine menace, serious as it was, would eventually yield to the technical solution that the recovered specimen made possible. And then an unexpected pause arrived, not through any British success, but through Hitler's strategic priorities. In the spring of 1940, the U-boat fleet was pulled from the Atlantic to support the invasion of Norway. For a time, the most dangerous actors in the Atlantic campaign were standing off stage. That pause would not last, and when it ended, the conditions would be entirely different. The fall of France was coming, and with it, a transformation of the naval war that no one in the Admiralty had fully anticipated. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany's armies began moving west. What followed was one of the most rapid military collapses in modern history, a cascade of defeats that reshaped the strategic map of the war in a matter of weeks. Holland fell in 5 days. Belgium lasted 18. By early June, the British Expeditionary Force had been forced back to the French coast and evacuated through Dunkirk in a desperate armada of naval vessels and civilian boats. Norway fell on the 8th of June, and on the 17th of that same month, the French government, stunned, demoralized, its armies broken, asked Germany for terms. France, which had shared with Britain the burden of naval protection across the Channel and the Bay of Biscay, was no longer in the war. The naval implications were immediate and serious. Britain took possession of 6 French warships and destroyed a substantial portion of the remaining French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria, a painful decision made to prevent those ships from potentially falling under German control. The bulk of what remained of the French Navy was eventually scuttled by the French themselves at Toulon in 1942. Either way, the warships that had been helping to police the Atlantic and the Mediterranean were gone. German troops arrived at the Channel ports. They spread along the coast of the Bay of Biscay, and U-boat crews who had recently been operating from bases in the Baltic and the North Sea, hundreds of miles from the Atlantic patrol areas, found themselves looking at a very different map. The French ports of Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and others along the Bay of Biscay now lay open to German use. Dönitz's staff toured the facilities and saw what was possible. Submarines operating from Lorient instead of Kiel were 450 miles closer to the Atlantic convoy lanes. The fuel saved on the shorter transit meant boats could remain on patrol longer. The time spent hunting rather than traveling increased dramatically, and shore-based aircraft, long-range reconnaissance planes operating from occupied French airfields, could extend the reach of German surveillance across vast stretches of the ocean, feeding convoy position reports to the headquarters at Carnival. The effect was almost immediate. In June 1940, roughly 600,000 tons of Allied shipping was lost. About half of that was sunk by U-boats. The pace was higher than anything seen in the preceding months, and it would continue to rise. The Royal Navy at this moment was also absorbing the consequences of the Norwegian campaign. The battle for Norway had been strategically successful for the German army but costly for the Navy. 6 U-boats had been lost. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau had both been put out of action. The heavy cruiser Blücher and 2 light cruisers had been sunk. 10 destroyers were gone. Germany's already limited surface navy was diminished further, pushing even more of the burden onto the submarines. Britain faced its own accounting. The loss of France meant that the areas the Royal Navy was responsible for covering had expanded enormously while the number of available ships had shrunk. Italy's entry into the war in June 1940 complicated matters further, adding a Mediterranean theatre to an already overstretched force. Escort vessels needed for the Atlantic were being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Senior German naval officers who walked the quays at Brest and St. Nazaire in those summer weeks and looked out across the Bay of Biscay toward the open Atlantic were looking at something close to an opportunity. The convoy routes were there, the ships were there, moving continuously, carrying everything Britain needed to survive. The bases from which to strike had just been handed to them, and the British, for all their traditions and their skill, were stretched thin and scrambling to adapt. The Battle of the Atlantic had existed as a concept since September 1939. It had been fought in fits and starts, constrained by geography and numbers and political decisions that moved the submarines away to other tasks. Now those constraints were lifting. The campaign was about to find its full, terrible character. South of the equator, in the vast and sparsely patrolled waters of the South Atlantic, the pocket battleship Graf Spee had been hunting since late September 1939. Her captain, Hans Langsdorff, was a naval officer of considerable skill and, by the standards of the war he was fighting, unusual humanity. A man who would go to lengths to preserve the lives of the crews aboard the ships he sank, even as he methodically sent those ships to the bottom. The Graf Spee's first kill had come off the coast of Brazil on September 30th. The British merchantman Clement was overtaken, her captain initially mistaking the approaching warship for a friendly British cruiser. He had gone below to change into a clean uniform before the seaplane bearing an iron cross swept in and shattered that impression. Langsdorff apologized before ordering the Clement sunk, a peculiar courtesy that nevertheless did nothing to save the ship. What followed was a disciplined campaign of disruption. Langsdorff moved between ocean zones, altered the Graf Spee's silhouette, changed her markings, and kept the British guessing about where she would appear next. In the weeks after the Clement, 3 more merchant ships went down, the Newton Beach, the Ashleigh, the Huntsman, each sinking carefully managed to minimize casualties. Langsdorff's concern for merchant sailors was genuine and consistent. He had prisoners from multiple vessels aboard his ship at various points and treated them with a consideration that would later be noted by those who attended the funerals of his own dead alongside him. The strategic impact of the Graf Spee's commerce raiding extended far beyond the tonnage she sank. A single pocket battleship in the South Atlantic compelled the Royal Navy to divert nearly 24 warships, cruisers, carriers, battleships, from duties elsewhere. The Ark Royal, the battlecruiser Renown, the French battleship Strasbourg, all redirected toward a hunt that proved elusive. because Langsdorff kept moving, kept changing direction, kept exploiting the simple fact that the ocean was enormous and his ship was one small shape within it. In mid-November, the Graf Spee slipped around the tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Off Madagascar, she sank the British tanker Africa Shell and then returned to the South Atlantic. By early December, she was approaching the River Plate, the wide, heavily traveled estuary between Argentina and Uruguay, a convergence point for British ships running between Buenos Aires and Montevideo and the ports of England. Langsdorff knew a convoy was assembling. He pressed forward. On the morning of December 13th, his lookout spotted masts on the horizon. The masts belonged to 3 British warships, the heavy cruiser Exeter and 2 light cruisers, the Ajax and the New Zealand vessel Achilles. None of them individually matched the Graf Spee's firepower. Collectively, they posed a more complex problem: fast, maneuverable, and under orders to attack immediately. The battle that followed was short and costly on both sides. The Exeter took the worst of it, hit multiple times by the Graf Spee's 11-inch guns. She lost her wheelhouse, had a turret blasted open, and was left partly out of control, her captain rigging a makeshift command station using a lifeboat compass and a chain of sailors relaying orders aft by voice. Still, she pressed forward. The Ajax lost 2 of her rear turrets. The Achilles captain was wounded, but the 3 British ships had also landed 18 hits on the Graf Spee, wrecking her galleys, damaging secondary armament, killing 37 men, and leaving holes in her hull and decking that would not seal on their own. Langsdorff decided the ship needed port. He chose Montevideo. There, in neutral Uruguay, the diplomatic pressure built from all directions. The Uruguayan government, caught between a German request for 2 weeks to complete repairs and a British ambassador arguing for immediate expulsion, granted 72 hours. Langsdorff pressed for time while a British disinformation campaign, feeding rumours through local channels that the Ark Royal and the Renown had arrived offshore, convinced him that a massive blocking force was waiting beyond the harbour mouth. In truth, only 1 additional heavy cruiser had joined the Ajax and the Achilles. The larger reinforcements were still hundreds of miles away. But Langsdorff believed what he had been told. On the evening of December 17th, launches ferried most of his crew to a German merchant vessel in the harbour. The Graf Spee then moved through the breakwater with her battle flags flying, travelled just beyond the 3-mile limit, and detonated. She burned for 4 days. Langsdorff himself did not survive to see what came next. In his quarters in Buenos Aires, he unrolled the ensign of the old Imperial German Navy. The flag of a service that had existed before the swastika lay down upon it and ended his life. The letter he left behind explained his reasoning in a single sentence. For a captain with a sense of honor, his personal fate could not be separated from that of his ship. The Graf Spee's sister ship, the Deutschland, had been operating in the North Atlantic during those same autumn months, and with far less impact. She sank 2 merchant vessels, 1 British and 1 Norwegian, and captured an American freighter, the City of Flint, whose subsequent fate set off an international incident. The Germans placed a prize crew aboard the Flint and directed her to Murmansk, where Russian authorities, honoring their non-aggression pact with Germany, declined to intern the German crew or restore the ship to American custody. When the Germans then attempted to sail the Flint through Norwegian waters toward Germany, the Norwegians intercepted her and returned the vessel to her rightful crew. The episode drew diplomatic protests from neutral nations and underscored how difficult it was to prosecute commerce raiding against ships whose nations had not yet chosen a side. Hitler, meanwhile, was consumed by a different anxiety. The Deutschland carried the name of Germany itself, and the prospect of losing a ship with that name in battle struck him as intolerable for public morale. He ordered the vessel renamed the Lützow, after a Prussian general of the Napoleonic era, and recalled her from the Atlantic after just one patrol, twice damaged by British torpedoes during subsequent operations off Norway. The Lützow never returned to the raiding campaign. By the close of the winter of 1940, Germany's conventional surface raiders had sunk only 11 ships totaling roughly 57,000 tons. The numbers were modest, but the strategic disruption they created had been real. 22 British warships organized into 9 hunting groups had spent months searching for 2 elusive pocket battleships. Every destroyer, every cruiser, every carrier committed to that hunt was a vessel unavailable for escort duty, anti-submarine patrols, or the protection of the convoy routes that Britain depended on. The instrument that would eventually dwarf all of this, in both tonnage destroyed and strategic impact, was not a pocket battleship. It was something far more anonymous, a converted freighter flying a false flag. Raeder had long envisioned armed merchant raiders as a supplement to his conventional warships. During the winter of 1939 and 1940, 6 aging cargo ships were quietly transformed in German Baltic ports, their holds fitted with concealed weapons, their silhouettes altered with telescoping funnels, detachable masts, and dummy deck cargoes that could be assembled and dismantled in hours to change the ship's apparent identity. 9 such vessels would eventually go to sea. Together, across 3.5 years, they would account for 130 ships totaling 850,000 tons, nearly 3 times the merchant tonnage destroyed by Germany's entire conventional surface navy. The first and most successful of these raiders was the Atlantis, which slipped out of Kiel on March 31st, 1940. Disguised as a Russian auxiliary warship, her captain Bernhard Roger was meticulous in his tradecraft, altering his ship's profile between engagements, selecting crew members to appear on deck based on physical appearance, maintaining radio silence for months at a stretch, taking aboard prisoners from sunk vessels and devising means of transferring them to other ships rather than leaving them adrift. The Atlantis remained at sea for 20 months. She covered more than 100,000 miles. She captured or sank 22 ships, among them an Egyptian vessel with American passengers aboard. When her luck finally ran out in November 1941, intercepted by a British cruiser near Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, most of her crew survived, rescued by a German submarine that happened to be operating in the area. Other raiders matched their own versions of that story. The small converted banana boat Thor fought 2 much larger British armed merchant cruisers to a standstill and eventually sank a third. The Steer and the Cormoran both went down in combat, but each managed to sink the Allied ship that destroyed them before the end. Among the raider captains, most shared Langsdorff's concern for the lives of enemy merchant crews, going to considerable trouble to ensure their safety after their ships were sunk. One notable exception was Helmuth von Ruckteschell, commanding the raider Widder, who fired on enemy ships without warning, prioritizing surprise over any obligation to the people aboard those vessels. He abandoned crews in open lifeboats on the open ocean with no provision for their rescue. One such lifeboat drifted for 70 days before making landfall in the Bahamas. Of the 7 men who had boarded it, 5 had gone mad and thrown themselves into the sea. The 2 survivors lived to give their account. Ruckteschel was convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg and died in prison. The disguised raiders would continue their operations until late 1943, gradually withdrawing from the Atlantic as British intelligence and naval coverage made the oceans increasingly hostile to anything flying a false flag. But in the first years of the war, moving through remote waters that Allied patrols rarely reached, they had demonstrated that the most dangerous predator on the ocean was sometimes the ship that looked most harmless. By the autumn of 1940, the Battle of the Atlantic was entering a new phase. Admiral Raeder, having dispatched his disguised raiders to the remote reaches of the ocean, now turned his attention to larger targets, the convoys themselves, those dense, slow-moving concentrations of merchant shipping that represented the most efficient way to destroy British supply in volume. In November, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer slipped past Iceland into the northwest Atlantic, the first major German surface warship to operate in those waters since the scuttling of the Graf Spee nearly a year earlier. Within days of arriving in the convoy lanes, she found exactly the kind of target Raeder had envisioned. Convoy HX-84 was eastbound from Halifax, Nova Scotia, carrying 37 merchant ships laden with supplies for Britain. Its escort consisted of a single vessel, the Jervis Bay, a converted passenger liner fitted with naval armament and classified as an armed merchant cruiser. Her guns were modest, her armor minimal. Against a pocket battleship armed with 11-inch guns, she was outclassed in every technical dimension. When the Scheer appeared on the horizon, Captain Edward Fagan of the Jervis Bay made a decision that required no deliberation. He ordered the convoy to scatter, individual ships dispersing in every direction, making themselves harder to round up, and turned his own ship at full speed directly toward the German pocket battleship. The Scheer opened fire from nearly 10 miles away, well beyond the effective range of the Jervis Bay's 6-inch guns. The British ship was hit again and again. She caught fire. Her guns were knocked out one by one. Fagan himself was mortally wounded, and still the Jervis Bay closed the range, firing whatever remained operable, buying time. The engagement lasted 22 minutes before the Jervis Bay went down. In those 22 minutes, the convoy had scattered far enough that the approaching darkness could hide most of it. The Scheer swept after the fleeing merchant ships as night fell, and found 6 of the 37. She sank 5. One of those 5 was the tanker San Demetrio, loaded with aviation gasoline. She was shelled and set ablaze, and her crew abandoned her. They knew the cargo could go up at any moment, a catastrophic explosion that would leave no survivors. The men pulled away in lifeboats into an Atlantic gale, and the San Demetrio drifted behind them, on fire and seemingly doomed. The following day, one of those lifeboats came upon the tanker again. She was still afloat, still burning. The second officer, with some of the crew huddled behind him, looked at the ship drifting in the grey swell. They had spent a night on an open lifeboat in an Atlantic winter storm. The tanker represented danger of a particular and vivid kind, a hull full of burning gasoline. But she was also, as one of the men later put it, the only thing they could see in the whole wide circle of ocean, and she was their own ship. They went back aboard. For 3 days they fought the fires from decks that blistered the soles of their boots. They repaired machinery by improvisation and determination, working with whatever tools they could find. At last the engines turned again. the second officer, with no navigational instruments but a school atlas salvaged from a drawer, and steering by the blackened stump of what had once been the ship's wheel, set a course for Liverpool on the 15th of November. 10 days after she had been abandoned to sink, the San Demetrio made port. The Sheer, aware that the Royal Navy would be converging on her position, turned south and then east toward the Indian Ocean. In 5 months at sea, she sank 16 ships, and the Admiralty was sufficiently shaken by her attack on HX-84 to begin assigning battleship escorts to the major convoys, a decision that further reduced the number of capital ships available for other purposes. The Jervis Bay's action was awarded the Victoria Cross, given posthumously to Captain Fagan. The convoy he died protecting had carried its supplies to Britain. The logic of his decision, sacrifice one ship to save 32, had been proven correct. What it also revealed with some discomfort was how vulnerable a convoy remained when its protection consisted of a single converted passenger ship armed with guns that could not reach the enemy firing at it. The lesson was understood. Acting on it, at the scale the situation demanded, was another matter entirely, and the resources to do so were not yet in place. The early months of 1941 brought the Battle of the Atlantic to a new level of intensity. By March, losses had reached 350,000 tons, a single month's total that exceeded anything previously recorded in the war, and a rate that Britain could not sustain indefinitely. The combined pressure of submarines, disguised raiders, mines, and surface ships was bending the supply system that kept Britain alive and fighting. In January, Raeder sent his 2 remaining battle cruisers into the Atlantic. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau slipped past the British blockade and spent 2 months ranging across the Halifax convoy route. In 2 months they destroyed 22 ships, including 13 in the space of just 2 days. The pace would have been higher still, but the 2 German captains twice turned away from large convoys because those convoys happened to be escorted by elderly British battleships, and Raeder's standing orders were clear. Do not risk the capital ships in direct engagements with British warships. The doctrine of dispersal and disruption did not include willingness to absorb damage in order to destroy a convoy's escort. By late March, the 2 battle cruisers had withdrawn into the French port of Brest. The Sheer, returning from her long Atlantic and Indian Ocean cruise, put into keel. The surface raiding campaign was, for the moment, pausing to refit, but Raeder was not finished. He was preparing something considerably larger. The Bismarck had been under construction since 1936. She was completed by 1941 and was, by any honest assessment, a formidable instrument of naval power. Listed officially at 35,000 tons to comply with treaty limits, she actually displaced more than 42,000 when empty, and considerably more in full operational condition. 823 feet from bow to stern, 120 feet across at the beam, her 8 15-inch guns could reach targets 15 miles away. Her sides and turrets were armored with nearly 13 inches of specially hardened steel. She could make 30 knots and carry 6 aircraft for reconnaissance. When Hitler watched her launch on Valentine's Day 1939, he spoke of the Iron Chancellor for whom she was named, and the crowd responded with something more than patriotic obligation. Raeder's plan was to deploy the Bismarck as the centerpiece of a task force that would be powerful enough to attack any convoy regardless of its escort, a force that no single British warship could outmatch. She would be joined by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and ideally by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sailing out from Brest, the combined group would enter the North Atlantic and operate against the convoy lanes with a freedom that no previous German surface force had possessed. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. The Scharnhorst had developed engine trouble and could not participate. The Gneisenau had been struck by a torpedo from a British aircraft during a raid on Brest, flown in low by a Canadian pilot, Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell, whose aircraft was shot to pieces seconds after the attack, but who had put the weapon squarely into the battle cruiser's stern. The Gneisenau was out of action for 6 months. The Prinz Eugen had struck a mine and required repairs. Admiral Günther Prien, whom Raeder had chosen to command the operation, recommended postponement. The new battleship Tirpitz, a sister ship to the Bismarck, would be ready within months. Waiting for her would give the task force genuine depth. Raeder refused. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen would go alone. There was one additional consideration that Raeder managed carefully. Hitler was not told the ships had sailed until they were already at sea and beyond recall. The Führer's anxiety about his capital ships was well documented. He had said openly that on land he was a hero and at sea a coward. The loss of a major warship, particularly the Bismarck, was something he contemplated with a dread that bordered on the superstitious. Raeder knew that seeking permission in advance might mean no permission was given. The decision was made, and the notification came after. On the evening of May 18, 1941, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen departed Gotenhafen on the Baltic and moved north. For the first time in the war, German warships carried orders to engage the British fleet if necessary. The most ambitious single operation that Germany's surface navy would ever undertake had begun. The British Admiralty knew the ships had sailed before Hitler did. Coded sighting reports arrived in London from Sweden and from members of the Norwegian resistance, relayed through channels that had taken months to establish and that now delivered their intelligence at precisely the moment it was needed. On May 21st, a Royal Air Force reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen anchored in a fjord south of Bergen, Norway, where they had paused to take on fuel. 2 days later, another flight showed the anchorage empty. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from Scapa Flow, moved immediately. A force built around the new battleship Prince of Wales, the battle cruiser Hood, and 6 destroyers was dispatched to guard the passages on either side of Iceland. Tovey himself sailed from Scapa Flow aboard the battleship King George V, accompanied by the carrier Victorious, the battle cruiser Repulse, and a screen of supporting vessels. The net was being drawn, though its threads were still widely spaced. Lütjens had taken his ships far to the north, navigating in stormy weather along the Greenland ice pack, threading the Denmark Strait, the cold, narrow passage between Iceland and the ice. There, on the evening of May 23rd, a patrolling British cruiser, the Suffolk, picked them up on radar at a range of 13 miles. The Suffolk and her companion, the Norfolk, kept contact and shadowed the larger German vessels through the night, feeding position reports to the approaching British force. The following morning, before dawn, Vice Admiral Holland's squadron closed to intercept. At the head of his line sailed the Hood. The Hood was the most famous warship afloat. She had spent the interwar years as the public face of British naval power, visiting ports from Zanzibar to San Francisco, admired for her length and grace, toured by generations of visitors. At 860 feet she was even longer than the Bismarck, and she carried 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. But she was old. The years between the wars had not been kind in a structural sense. A ship designed for one era of naval combat, pressed into service in another. The armor protection over her magazines, which might have been upgraded when the technology of explosive penetration advanced, had not been. Beside her sailed the Prince of Wales, nearly the opposite problem. So newly commissioned that civilian technical workers from Vickers were still aboard, trying to resolve mechanical difficulties with her 14-inch gun mountings when she sailed from Scapa Flow. The guns would jam and misfire during the engagement ahead. In the early hours of May 24th, Holland signaled the order to prepare for action. Battle ensigns were broken out on both ships. Aboard the Prince of Wales, a naval officer named Esmond Knight, who had been an actor before the war, stood watching as the distant shapes of the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen resolved out of the grey horizon. Enormous, he heard someone mutter beside him, sinister in their composure, steaming in line ahead as if they owned the water beneath them. The Hood opened fire first at 5:52 in the morning. Orange flashes lit her forward turrets. Then the Prince of Wales added her own weight. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen returned fire almost simultaneously, and the incoming shells arrived with a sound that Knight would later describe as an underground train approaching, a rushing, deepening roar that filled the air before the waterspouts climbed around the British ships. The engagement had been running for only a few minutes when a shell struck the Hood in precisely the location her designers had most feared. It reached the magazine. The explosion that followed was unlike anything Knight or anyone else aboard the Prince of Wales had ever witnessed. A vast tongue of pale fire erupted from the center of the ship and climbed into the sky. Enormous fragments rose and tumbled through the air. A towering column of smoke unfolded above the water where the battle cruiser had been. And then, within seconds, the Hood was gone, broken, scattered across the cold water of the Denmark Strait. Of the 1,419 men who had been aboard her, 3 survived. The Prince of Wales was now alone, and she was taking hits. A shell struck her bridge, killing or wounding everyone in it except Captain John Leach and one other man. The ship's 14-inch batteries were misfiring. Leach made the only reasonable decision available to him. He pulled back, joined the Suffolk and the Norfolk, and continued the vital work of shadowing the Bismarck while Tovey's main force raced to close the distance. Captain Lindemann of the Bismarck urged Lütjens to turn for home immediately. The tactical surprise was gone. Every British warship in the Atlantic now knew their position, and they would be converging from all directions. Lütjens modified the plan rather than abandoning it. He detached the Prinz Eugen to hunt merchant shipping independently, while the Bismarck turned toward the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs. 2 British shells had found her during the engagement, and one of them had ruptured a fuel tank. She was trailing oil across the ocean. Until that tank could be repaired in dry dock, her range was compromised. Lütjens radioed Berlin to request that a line of U-boats be positioned between his position and the French coast, over which he hoped to draw his pursuers into an ambush. Then, for 6 hours, the Suffolk's radar lost the Bismarck entirely. A navigational error compounded the loss. British planners, working from a misread position report, concluded the Bismarck was some 200 miles north of her actual location. The entire pursuit steered in the wrong direction, burning irreplaceable fuel. What should have been Lütjens' opportunity to slip away was squandered by a transmission error of his own. Not realizing that contact had been lost, He chose this moment to send a long radio message to Berlin, describing the engagement in the Denmark Strait. The message ran for more than 30 minutes. British direction-finding stations triangulated the source. The Bismarck was located again. Cryptanalysts reading decoded German radio traffic eventually established that Lütjens was heading for Brest, not Saint-Nazaire. The pursuing forces swung onto the correct bearing. The net began to tighten again. Though the Bismarck had opened a significant lead, and most of Tovey's escort vessels were now dangerously short of fuel. From Gibraltar, Force H was steaming north. The carrier Ark Royal, the battle cruiser Renown, and the cruiser Sheffield. On the afternoon of May 26th, 15 Swordfish torpedo bombers from the Ark Royal were launched against what their crews believed to be the Bismarck. In the thick weather and poor visibility, they attacked the Sheffield instead. Fortunate maneuvering and prematurely detonating magnetic exploders on most of the torpedoes prevented a catastrophe that would have been almost incomprehensible. The Ark Royal's aircraft went out again before dark, this time carrying contact exploders and with the Sheffield now clearly identified ahead of them. 2 torpedoes struck the Bismarck. One did no damage. The second hit the stern, flooding the steering engine room and jamming both rudders at a 15-degree angle. Every combination of engine power Lindemann tried brought the bow swinging back toward the northwest, toward the oncoming British fleet, rather than away from it. The night that followed aboard the Bismarck was a descent. Volunteer divers went into the flooded steering compartment to try to free the jammed rudders. They could not. A message from Hitler, "The whole of Germany is with you," it read, circulated among the exhausted crew. Destroyers appeared in the dark and harassed the stricken battleship through the night. By morning, the King George V and the Rodney were closing from the northwest. At 8:47 on the morning of May 27th, the Rodney opened fire from 12 miles away. The King George V followed immediately. The Bismarck returned fire, but her maneuvering was reduced to the most basic adjustments of speed. The Rodney's third salvo destroyed one of the Bismarck's forward turrets. Shell after shell found her superstructure. The Norfolk and the Dorsetshire joined from the flanks. The 2 British battleships closed to 4 miles, then to 2 point-blank range by the standards of naval gunnery. By 10 o'clock, the Bismarck's guns had fallen silent. Her fire control systems were wrecked. Her decks were torn open. Fires moved through her compartments. Lieutenant Commander Gerhard Unack, making his way topside through passages lit only by the red glow of burning interior spaces, organized the men on deck and gave them what orders he could. Stay together in the water, keep calm, do not give up hope. They completed a triple Sieg Heil, and then the order came to abandon ship. The Bismarck rolled to port, her deck rail going under, her hull rising above the surface for a moment, and then she slid bow last into the Atlantic. Of the more than 2,000 men who had sailed from Gotenhafen 9 days earlier, 110 were rescued. Admiral Lütjens was not among them. Neither was Captain Lindemann. It was past midnight. The North Atlantic stretched out in every direction under a moonless sky, dark and cold and still except for the low swell that lifted the U-99 in a slow, rhythmic motion. Lieutenant Commander Otto Kretschmer stood at the conning tower rail and drew on a freshly lit cigar, letting the smoke drift away in the salt air. He had left Wilhelmshaven in late June 1940, moving across the North Sea into the Atlantic, then south past the Hebrides toward the patrol area that headquarters had assigned him. The new U-boat base at Lorient was now operational, but the patrol rhythms were still being established, and Kretschmer was methodical in how he used his time. By early July, he had already sunk 2 ships, a Canadian steamer and a Swedish freighter he had determined was running supplies to Britain. 1 torpedo each, clean, economical, and consistent with the approach he had developed through training and conviction. Then a lookout stiffened at his post. Binoculars swung east. The cigar made a brief dying arc over the railing. Emerging through the western approaches was the first convoy the U-99 had ever encountered. 2 columns of merchant ships, a destroyer on each flank, another running ahead. Kretschmer drove his boat at full diesel speed for nearly 2 hours to position himself directly in the convoy's path, then submerged before dawn and waited for the ships to pass over him. He had long held a particular theory about attacking convoys, that the right approach was from inside them, threading the columns rather than striking from the flanks. Now he had the opportunity to test it, as the convoy arrived overhead and the destroyer on the port side swept past uncomfortably close enough that Kretschmer had started to order a crash dive before the escort zigged away. The leading merchant ships began to present themselves on either side. He fired. The U-9 shuddered with the recoil, and then the waiting began. Nothing. He fired again. 1 tube misfired, the torpedo launching late, and then, after what felt like an unreasonable interval, a single distant flash lit the water. The 1 late torpedo had found a large ship, possibly a liner. Every other weapon had either missed or failed to detonate. There was something wrong with the torpedoes. Angry and unsatisfied, Kretschmer had no choice but to withdraw. As he pulled away, the hydrophone operator reported propeller sounds above. An escort, drawn by the single explosion, was tracking toward them. The depth charges came in patterns, each one a concussive blow that threw men and equipment sideways, dropped the boat 20 feet through the water column, and filled the interior with the specific fear that comes from being enclosed in steel and very far from the surface. Kretschmer took the U-99 down to 350 feet, below the rated safe depth for his class of boat, and ordered all non-essential electrical systems shut down. Speed could not save them here. Any fast movement would only betray their position. The only option was stillness, patience, and very careful management of the remaining air. Over the next several hours, 107 depth charges were dropped above them. Men lay on the deck to conserve oxygen. Buckets served in place of the heads, and the atmosphere grew dense with everything that accumulates in a sealed metal tube when it has been shut for a long time. Kretschmer circulated through the boat, exchanged words with those who seemed to need them, and returned to the control room to sit with a detective novel held in front of him. One of his crew noticed after a while that the novel was upside down. 18 hours after submerging, the attacks finally stopped. The destroyers moved away. Kretschmer waited another 2.5 hours before surfacing, and when the hatch opened and the diesel fans pulled fresh air down through the hull, the men came up from below and lay on the deck in the darkness, letting the cold Atlantic wind clear their lungs. They were still alive, and the area still had shipping in it. 3 days later, Kretschmer sank a Greek steamer. The same day, the U-99 captured an Estonian freighter and directed her captain to proceed to Bordeaux at pistol point. A bluff that worked, though it ended badly for the Merisar when a Focke-Wulf bomber sighted her approaching the coast and sank her before she arrived. When the U-99 reached Lorient, Kretschmer and his crew were the first boat from the Baltic to complete the trip to the new French base. They arrived in British battle dress, the only spare uniforms available left behind at Dunkirk, and were inspected by Grand Admiral Raeder himself, who awarded Kretschmer the Knight's Cross on the quayside. It was the beginning of what the young commanders of the U-boat arm would later call the happy time. Kretschmer's patrol had been a triumph in the individual sense, survived, decorated, a string of sinkings attached to his name. But Dönitz reviewed it with a more complicated set of feelings. The episode on the July convoy illustrated with uncomfortable precision everything that was both admirable and insufficient about the current state of submarine warfare. Kretschmer had found a convoy. He had attacked it alone. His torpedoes had failed him, which was a technical problem that would eventually be solved, but even setting the torpedo failures aside, a single U-boat attacking a defended convoy was operating at a serious disadvantage. The escorts could concentrate their attention on one threat. The attacker's options narrowed the moment he was detected, and the damage inflicted by a single submarine, however skilled its commander, was a fraction of what the same situation offered to a coordinated group. More than 250,000 tons of Allied shipping had been sent to the bottom in June 1940 alone. The rate was rising. The submarines were effective, but Dönitz remained convinced that effectiveness was leaving a significant portion of its potential unrealized. Too many convoys were slipping through. Too many attacks were being broken off before they reached full destructive force. The arithmetic of what he believed was possible, with the right numbers of submarines properly coordinated, did not match the arithmetic of what was actually being achieved. The answer, as Dönitz had understood for more than 2 decades, was the Wolf Pack. The idea had roots in his own wartime experience. Toward the very end of the previous war, he had planned a coordinated mission with another U-boat commander, what he later described as the first ever attempt to operate 2 submarines together in a joint attack. The other boat had been forced into port for repairs before the operation could begin. Dönitz had gone ahead alone, penetrated a destroyer screen with some difficulty, scored a single hit, and then been fired on and lost 7 men. The lesson he drew from it was direct. The greater the number of submarines attacking simultaneously, the more favorable the geometry for each individual attacker. Escorts that could concentrate against one threat could not concentrate against 6. The obstacles to implementing this approach had been real, and in the previous war had proven insurmountable. Radio communications in 1918 required a surfaced submarine to rig cumbersome aerials before signaling, a slow, unreliable process that made real-time coordination across hundreds of miles essentially impossible. By 1939, those limitations had been overcome. Modern radio allowed submarines on the surface to communicate with each other and with headquarters at distances that would have been implausible a generation earlier. The technology that made the Wolfpack tactically viable had arrived. The procedure Dönitz had developed was precise in its logic. U-boats were deployed in lines or staggered formations across the main convoy routes, spaced widely enough to cover large areas of ocean while remaining close enough for the tactic to function. The first submarine to sight a convoy would radio headquarters with position, course, speed, and the number of vessels and escorts. It would then shadow the convoy continuously, reporting at intervals, making no attack, or only a limited one until enough submarines had been directed to the scene to overwhelm the escort. Once the pack was assembled and darkness had fallen, the attack would begin from multiple directions simultaneously. Implementing this required not just the submarines but the command infrastructure to manage them. Dönitz's headquarters at Carnival, near Lorient, maintained continuous awareness of every boat's position, fuel state, and torpedo load. He tracked them on charts like a chess player watching a board. The cryptanalysis section of the German Navy provided a significant advantage during this period, deciphering British convoy routing messages that revealed where the ships would be and when. Dönitz could position his lines accordingly. But in the early summer of 1940, the submarine numbers were still too thin to make the strategy fully operational. Germany had begun the war with 46 submarines, and a year later the count was the same. The promised acceleration in construction had been authorized but had not yet translated into commissioned vessels. The rate of loss, approximately 2 boats per month, consumed virtually everything that the yards were producing, until late 1941, when the building program genuinely began to deliver. Dönitz was running a wolfpack strategy with a marginal wolfpack. And then the campaign had been disrupted by Norway, the entire submarine fleet withdrawn from Atlantic operations to support an invasion that proved successful for the army and damaging for the navy. 6 boats were lost. The torpedo crisis that had been simmering since the war's beginning became fully visible when repeated attacks against Norwegian targets produced almost nothing. Of 14 attempts against a single cruiser, none succeeded. The magnetic detonators that were supposed to make German torpedoes more lethal than conventional weapons were instead making them unreliable to the point of uselessness. Dönitz suspended operations while the torpedo problem was diagnosed and corrected, a 2-month pause during which impact detonators replaced magnetic ones across the fleet. When the submarines returned to the Atlantic, their weapons worked again. The French bases were operational, the convoy routes were mapped, the strategy was ready. All that remained was the opportunity. Shortly before midnight on October 16, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Heinrich Bleichrodt in the U-48 was standing on his conning tower approximately 180 miles northwest of the tiny island of Rockall when the first shapes emerged from the western darkness, 30-odd shadows moving slowly eastward, 3 smaller shapes running alongside, escorts working the flanks and the front of the formation like patient guardians. Convoy SC-7 was heading for Britain. Bleichrodt had been trained for exactly this moment. He brought the U-48 in close to the convoy's port column, remaining on the surface in the darkness where Asdic could not reach him, and settled into position about a mile off the nearest ships. He radioed Lorient with everything he had observed: position, course, speed, the size of the convoy, the number and placement of the escorts. Then he fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at a cluster of overlapping merchant vessels. 2 found their targets. A French tanker ignited and a British freighter shuddered to a stop, her deck cargo of pit props cascading into the sea. Both ships went down. Dawn came and forced Bleichrodt to withdraw before he could press the attack further. Then, while he was still submerged and reforming for another pass, a British Sunderland aircraft swept in and dropped 2 bombs that rocked the U-48 and drove her deep. An escort had been alerted, and for 8 hours the depth charges fell, none reaching below 400 feet fortunately, but enough to pin Bleichrodt down while the convoy moved farther east. At Lorient, Dönitz tracked the situation closely and moved his available pieces. Several U-boats had already been directed toward the convoy's course, though some were still hours away. Otto Kretschmer in the U-99 signaled that he would be at least an hour late at the rendezvous. Heinrich Lieber in the U-38 seemed too far removed to arrive in time. But Lieber spotted the convoy independently away to his south as dusk gathered on October 17th. He radioed the exact position and then made his approach, firing one spread at midnight that sank one freighter and missed with the next. His greater contribution was the radio message itself. With it, Dönitz now knew precisely where SC-7 would be when darkness came again. A formation of submarines was arranged across the convoy's projected course. Fritz Frauenheim in the U-101 fixed the starboard column early in the day. By afternoon, the pack was converging. What followed on the night of October 17th and into the early hours of October 18th was the first demonstration at full scale of what the Wolfpack strategy could accomplish. Endras in the U-46 fired first, and a Swedish freighter capsized within 10 minutes. Möller in the U-123 sank two ships nearly simultaneously. Then Kretschmer arrived in the U-99, threading his boat into the middle of the convoy formation, precisely the approach he had theorized and tested, and began picking off targets one by one with single torpedoes, his economy of effort a kind of signature. For 40 minutes he was chased across the dark water by a large British freighter that had spotted him in the moonlight, twisting and turning to avoid the angle of the ship's stern gun, until he managed to fire a torpedo that missed his pursuer but struck another vessel behind her. The sea around the convoy became a shifting landscape of fire, smoke, and descending ships. Some settled slowly, the waterline rising up their sides in measured increments. Others broke apart abruptly. The steamship Sedgepool, her bow blown off, went straight down nose first, propellers still spinning above the water. Where many of the cargoes were timber, pit props for coal mines, the sea became thick with floating wood, broken wire lashings trailing beneath the surface to lacerate the hands and arms of men struggling to stay afloat. Oil fires moved across the water. The escorts churned back and forth, their ASDIC sets unable to locate submarines that never went below the surface. Of the 35 ships in convoy SC-7, 15 reached port. Kretschmer alone had sunk 6. The Wolfpack had lost none. They were still at sea when word arrived from Lorient that a faster, larger convoy, 49 vessels, including many tankers, was approaching on nearly the same track. The boats with torpedoes remaining joined Lieber and Prien in the U-47 and turned to intercept. The pattern of the previous night was repeated some 200 miles to the west, but with oil rather than timber burning across the water, and with the human cost proportionally higher. 12 more ships went down before dawn gave relief to convoy HX-79. The young commanders came home to congratulations from Dönitz, messages from the Führer, and broadcast by Goebbels celebrating the victories to a nation that heard them as proof of German maritime supremacy. The men aboard those returning submarines had reasons to be proud and reasons to be sober. They had proven a strategy. They had demonstrated what concentration could achieve against a defended convoy. The escort screens that had seemed formidable dissolved under simultaneous attack from multiple angles. What lay ahead, though, was not simply more of the same. The British would adapt. More escorts would be built. New detection methods would be developed. The Atlantic winter was already closing in, bringing weather that made sustained operations nearly impossible. And Dönitz still did not have the 300 submarines he believed were necessary to close the ocean entirely. He had proven the concept. The war itself still had years to run, years in which both sides would push harder, lose more, and discover what they were capable of under the pressure of absolute necessity. The Wolfbacks had arrived, and the battle had found its true and terrible shape.